The sun rises over a land torn apart. Spain, once a powerful empire, is now a battlefield of smoldering villages, shattered armies, and a people pushed to the edge of despair. In 1809, Napoleon's legions dominate Europe. His brother Joseph sits on the Spanish throne, backed by nearly 300,000 French troops spread across the Iberian Peninsula. On paper, the conquest of Spain should have been easy, but Napoleon has misjudged something far more dangerous than any army. He has underestimated the will of an entire nation. The Peninsular War is about to transform from a mere campaign into a violent struggle for survival. And between 1809 and 1811, it will break armies, shatter empires, and expose the first deep cracks in Napoleon's invincibly fight. Across the hills and mountains of Spain, resistance erupts. Guerrilla fighters, peasants, farmers, priests, and deserters strike at French supply lines, ambush patrols, and disappear into the night. They know every trail, every gorge, every hiding place. To the French, they are ghosts appearing without warning, killing without mercy, then fading into the landscape. Napoleon calls Spain his ulcer, a bleeding wound that refuses to heal, and it's about to get worse. While Napoleon fights his great battles in Central Europe, one man rises to challenge his rule in Spain. ArthurWellesley.com. Calculating, disciplined, the British government sends him back to Portugal in 1809, trusting him to turn a chaotic defensive war into something decisive. Wellesley is outnumbered and often outmatched, but he understands something. Crucial: Portugal's rugged terrain can be turned into a fortress, and France can be beaten not with brute force, but with timing, patience, and precision. Wellesley's first task is to rebuild a shattered army, molding British and Portuguese troops into an effective fighting force. He studies French movements, supply lines, and weak points. The men marched from Lisbon, crossing scorching plains and treacherous mountain paths. Every step brings them closer to the looming storm. Marshal Nicholas Soult, one of Napoleon's most aggressive commanders, has invaded northern Portugal. His troops have marched deep into the country, capturing cities, plundering resources, believing the British are too weak to challenge them. But Wellesley moves like a knife in the dark. He strikes suddenly at the Battle of Guerrilla, pushing Soult back with precision volleys and controlled aggression. Days later, the British storm Porto in a daring river crossing under heavy fire. Soult, caught between Wellesley's advance and an enraged population rising behind him, is forced into a desperate retreat through the mountains, abandoning equipment and wagons, his army reduced to fragments. It is the first great blow of the Peninsular War, and it sends shockwaves through France. But Napoleon does not accept defeat lightly. To crush Wellesley, he unleashes some of his finest marshals: Massena, Ney, Victor, Suchet, veterans of Austerlitz, Jana Friedland, men who have never known what it is to lose. The French regroup. Their armies stretch across Spain in long sweeping arcs, designed to trap the British and Portuguese against the sea. The summer of 1809 becomes a season of relentless marching. Dust clouds rise from roads where tens of thousands of boots thunder onward. Villagers flee as cannon rumble across their fields. French columns advance with cold confidence, banners snapping in the wind. Near Talavera, west of Madrid, they meet Wellesley. Talavera becomes the first major test of the new British-Portuguese army. Wellesley's men stand shoulder to shoulder on the ridges, under a blazing sun that turns the battlefield into an oven. French infantry pour forward in massive columns, drums pounding, bayonets glinting. The air trembles with musket fire, the thunder of artillery shaking the ground. British volleys strike with machine-like precision, ripping through the French ranks. Marshal Victor launches attack after attack, his men climbing the slopes again and again into sheets of fire. The fighting becomes savage. Smoke blinds the soldiers. Muskets grow too hot to touch. At night, the French try a surprise attack in the darkness, bayonets flashing in the starlight, and for a moment the line nearly breaks. But the British hold. By dawn, the ground is covered in bodies, but Wellesley stands victorious. Talavera electrifies Britain. Wellesley is rewarded with a new title, Viscount Wellington. But he knows something the politicians do not. Victory in Spain is not won on the battlefield alone. It requires endurance, strategy, and a fortress powerful enough to stop Napoleon's mightiest armies. He begins a secret project. The lines of Torres Vedras, dozens of fortifications stretch across the hills north of Lisbon like a gigantic stone wall. Hidden gun batteries, trenches, redoubts, and kill zones are carved into the landscape. The French have no idea they exist. In Itembabaishir, Marshal Massena invades Portugal with one of the finest French armies ever assembled. He is the favorite child of victory, undefeated in dozens of battles. Napoleon orders him to drive Wellington into the sea. Confidence runs high, but the road to Lisbon is long, and Wellington is always one step ahead. Massena wins a brutal battle at Busaco, forcing the British to retreat. But when he reaches the mysterious fortifications of Torres Vedras, his triumph turns to fury. Before him stands the impossible. Miles of fortifications that cannot be bypassed, overwhelmed, or starved out. Wellington's plan is working. He burns the countryside behind him, denying the French the supplies they desperately need. Winter rains turn the land into a wasteland of mud and starvation. By early Bailly, Massena estimates the army is dying where it stands. With no food, no reinforcements, and no hope, Massena begins a desperate retreat. But Wellington is ready. He unleashes his army in a relentless pursuit, striking wherever the French falter. At Fuentes de Oñoro, the two armies collide in a deadly clash of infantry, cavalry, and raw determination. Streets turn into killing grounds. Cannon tear houses apart. British and French soldiers fight hand-to-hand in alleyways, filled with smoke and dust. The French cavalry charges in massive waves, sabers cutting through the ranks. Portuguese troops, once dismissed as unreliable, fight with heroic resolve. Wellington races along the lines, issuing orders, reinforcing weak points, turning the chaos of battle into a masterpiece of controlled defense. By nightfall, the French retreat again. Meanwhile, in eastern Spain, Marshal Soult wins stunning victories, capturing Valencia after a brutal siege. But even these triumphs cannot stop the tide turning in Wellington's favor. His army grows stronger. French armies are stretched thin. Guerrilla attacks intensify, hitting convoys, destroying communications, strangling French control of the countryside. By late 1811, the truth is clear. The French hold the cities, but they no longer hold Spain. The Peninsular War becomes a slow, grinding collapse of Napoleon's once mighty empire in the West. What began as a swift conquest has become a quagmire that drains his armies, consumes his resources, and undermines his prestige. And as Wellington prepares for the campaigns that will carry him to Salamanca, Vitoria, and ultimately into France itself, Europe watches in growing disbelief. Napoleon, the conqueror of nations, is losing a war he thought he had already won. The years 1809 to 1811 show the world that French power is not invincible. Guerrillas strike at will. Portuguese fortresses stand firm. British valleys break the confidence of Napoleon's marshals. And through it all, Wellington's calm, methodical brilliance shapes each battle, each strategy, each victory. Spain refuses to kneel. Portugal refuses to fall. And the spark that ignites the downfall of a European empire begins here, in the villages, hills, and blood-soaked fields of the Peninsular War. The war is far from over, but its end has already begun. The dust of Spain hangs thick in the air, carried by a hot, merciless wind that sweeps across ruined villages and blood-stained fields. It is 1809, and Napoleon's empire stretches from Lisbon to Moscow, a colossus dominating Europe. But here, in the rugged hills and ancient cities of the Iberian Peninsula, something is happening that the emperor never expected. His invincible armies are bleeding, his marshals are failing, and a rebellion that should have been crushed in weeks has become a brutal, grinding war of survival. This is the Peninsular War, a conflict of ambushes, sieges, betrayal, and catastrophe. A war that will haunt Napoleon for the rest of his life. It begins with arrogance. In 1807, French troops marched through Spain under the pretext of invading Portugal. But within months, they seized Spanish fortresses, occupied Spanish cities, and dethroned the Spanish king. Napoleon replaced him with his brother, Joseph Bonaparte. What seemed like a masterstroke soon turned into disaster. Spain erupted in revolt. Peasants, priests, nobles, and ordinary citizens rose in fury. Cities barricaded their streets, villages formed militias, and in the shadows, guerrilla fighters launched ambush after ambush, cutting down French patrols and burning supply convoys. Napoleon had unleashed a war unlike anything he had ever faced. By 1809, the French controlled major cities, Madrid, Seville, Barcelona. But they controlled almost nothing beyond the walls. Every road was a death trap. Every forest hid muskets and knives. Every town square was a spark waiting to ignite. The French soldiers, veterans of Austerlitz and Jena, suddenly found themselves fighting ghosts. They marched through Spain in tight columns, knowing the hills around them were alive, with eyes watching their every move. And when the trap sprang, it was sabak. Guerrillas attacked at night, disappeared at dawn, and melted into the population. The Empire's finest troops were powerless. Into this chaos marched a man who had already learned how to fight Napoleon, Arthur Wellesley. Calm/calculating. Deceptively cautious, Wellesley had built his reputation in India, winning battles with precision and discipline. Now he returned to Portugal and built a defensive network that stunned Europe. The lines of Torres Vedras were unlike anything Napoleon's marshals had ever encountered. Forts carved into mountains, hidden redoubts, trenches, and artillery positions stretching across miles of Portuguese hills. Behind these lines, the British army waited, supplied by sea, protected from encirclement, and impossible to starve into surrender. Marshal Soult and Marshal Massena believed they could break Wellesley. They were wrong. In the spring of 1809, Soult invaded Portugal, capturing Oporto in a brutal assault that left the city burning. But Wellesley struck back with astonishing speed. His men crossed the Douro River in broad daylight, stormed the French positions, and sent Soult fleeing into the mountains, abandoning his artillery, wagons, and wounded. It was a humiliation, one Napoleon would never forget. The war accelerated. French reinforcements poured into Spain. New marshals arrived, each determined to succeed where the others had failed. Yet the guerrilla attacks only grew more violent. French troops responded with brutal reprisals, executions, burnings, mass arrests. But repression only made the rebellion stronger. Napoleon's armies now had to fight two wars, one against Wellesley's regular army, and one against the hidden Spanish resistance that struck from every direction. Then came 1810. Marcel Massena, one of Napoleon's greatest generals, marched into Portugal with 65,000 men. His orders were simple: crush Wellesley, seize Lisbon, and throw the British into the sea. Massena did not fear the British. He believed them weak, slow, untested compared to the veterans of Napoleon's Grand Army. But he had never faced Wellesley's defensive genius. The two armies clashed at Busaco, high in the Portuguese mountains. At dawn, Massena sent wave after wave of French infantry up the steep slopes. The British held their fire until the French were close, then unleashed deadly volleys that tore their ranks apart. Every French assault failed. By sunset, Massena had lost thousands, but he pushed on toward Lisbon, only to discover the unthinkable. The lines of Torres Vedras fortresses seemed to rise from nowhere. Artillery stared down from cliffs that looked untouched by human hands. There were traps, ditches, hidden roads, rifle pits, and supply depots, all meticulously positioned. It was a masterpiece of military engineering, built in silence, hidden from spies, invisible until it was too late. Massena stared at the lines and understood the truth. He could not break them. He tried anyway, settling his army in the surrounding countryside, hoping to starve the British out. But it was the French who starved. Portuguese civilians abandoned their farms, leaving nothing behind. French troops gnawed on leather, dug for roots, fought each other for scraps. Disease swept through their camps. Winter cold crushed their morale. Massena's mighty army began to rot. By early 1811, he had no choice. He ordered a retreat. It was one of the ugliest in French history. Guerrillas attacked the rear guard, slaughtered stragglers, burned wagons, and snatched away prisoners. Wellesley's divisions pursued relentlessly. Every bridge became a choke point of death. Every mountain pass echoed with musket fire. Messina managed to save part of his army, but the truth was undeniable. The French had failed. The Peninsular War, once a sideshow, had become a nightmare. An open wound, bleeding men, and resources France could not spare. In 1811, a new figure emerged. General Rowland Hill. Swift, aggressive, and fearless, Hill launched devastating raids deep behind French lines, smashing depots, overrunning outposts, and slicing communications. His lightning attacks terrified the French marshals, who now faced threats from every direction. Wellesley tightened the noose with each move. Then came the siege of Almeida. Inside the fortress, French soldiers endured hunger, desperation, and constant bombardment. Outside, the French army scrambled to relieve the garrison. On a fog-shrouded night, Wellesley struck again, not with brute force, but with deception. A single misjudged explosion inside Almeida ignited storehouses of powder, blasting apart the fortress from within and forcing the French into retreat. By the end of 1811, everything had changed. Napoleon's armies still held Spain's major cities, but the countryside belonged to the guerrillas. His marshals were exhausted, wounded, humiliated, and Wellesley's army was no longer merely defending Portugal, it was preparing to invade Spain. The Peninsular War had become a vortex, pulling Napoleon's empire into chaos. Every victory he won elsewhere, Wagram, Dresden, meant nothing if Spain continued to drain his strength. The emperor had once boasted that conquering Spain would be easy. "I shall conquer Spain in 6 months." 3 years later, not even Napoleon himself could enter the peninsula. And the war that raged there, this brutal struggle of ambushes, starvation, sieges, and shattered armies, was setting the stage for Napoleon's downfall. For in the shadows of 1809 to 1811, the seeds of collapse were already sown. The Spanish people were unbroken. The British army was growing stronger, and Wellesley, the quiet, methodical general whom Napoleon mocked as the sepoy general, was becoming the one man in Europe capable of defeating the emperor himself. Spain had become Napoleon's graveyard, and he had not yet realized it.